So welcome everybody to this week's episode of Activist Lawyer. Sarah in the studio with Jack.
Hello everybody.
He's here too. And we are joined by the lovely Maria McCloskey. Thanks Maria for coming on this rainy Friday.
You're welcome. Lovely to be here, Sarah.
You made the journey and it's lovely to have you in the studio, which is just great. Great for us to have you here. So we're going to touch on a few issues today and go through your work, Maria, which is really important and really kind of topical at the moment. And then we're going to talk a little bit about you, of course, and your background. And I think that's what our listeners love to hear as well. Have different examples of people. You know, law is such a vast area to work in, and it's great to kind of have a variety of guests here. So we'll talk about that. But just by way of brief introduction to listeners, Maria is an immigration solicitor, so like myself, at Children's Law Centre, NI, and she represents unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Maria provides advice and representation in their asylum claims and any other legal issues arising during the course of the application process. She also represents clients who are referred to the National Referral Mechanism as victims or potential victims of trafficking. Maria also tutors on a number of courses at the Institute of Professional Legal Studies, like a lot of our guests this year. And she was the chair of the Immigration Practitioners Group of the Law Society of NI, which was fantastic, from September 2017 until, that was 2 years ago, yeah.
Yes.
I remember, so just after we started here. And Maria, you're now the current chair of the Law Society's Human Rights and Equality Working Group.
That's correct.
And that was set up not too long ago.
That was established in September last year, so it's just a year old. It's coming up to our year anniversary.
Very good. That's fantastic. Well, look, thank you again for joining us. So really just, I suppose we'll start with the Children's Law Centre as well.
Yeah.
How's it working there? And, you know, your role a little bit, if we can go into that.
Sure. So I joined the Children's Law Centre 3 weeks before the lockdown in March of last year. I have joined the organisation on the basis of its focus on children's rights, and I'll come on to just explain my background and my journey towards that. But the Children's Law Centre is an independent charitable organisation which works towards a society where children can participate and are valued and have their rights respected and guaranteed without discrimination. So it's really working towards achieving the full potential of all children in our society, and that's everyone under the age of 18. Okay. Even though we sometimes don't like to call them children, we refer to them as young people, because I know that young people who are age 17 don't want to be called children, but they are our clientele.
They're your clientele. Gosh, okay. And just in terms of the area, so it's pretty much everything in terms of the service provision.
That's right.
And yours is very specific then.
Yes. So the immigration department, that's a CLC for short, you'll hear me saying CLC, was established in September 2019, just 2 years ago.
Okay.
So up until then, they didn't have a separate immigration department. They did provide some immigration advice, but often had to refer on to private practitioners, depending on the nature of the case or query. And it was established in 1987, and since then it has really become experts in the fields of mental health, special educational and disability needs, and education in general. So they do a lot of policy and advocacy work in all of those areas. And we also have an advice line, so really anything that children or parents of children who have issues can come to Children's Law Centre. They can provide initial advice and deal with the case if it's within our expertise, or refer onwards to other practitioners. So you have everything from, mental health, to the recent voucher scheme, the High Street voucher scheme, which our policy worker is advocating on very strongly at the moment. So it's a wide
I've seen that actually. I've seen a lot on that.
Because it's kind of just going to miss young, as you say, young people, like they've just kind of been forgotten about for the scheme. Like, so.
Absolutely.
So it's really broad reaching. And just in terms of your own, would you be involved in the policy and kind of advocacy piece too? I know you represent children as well at hearings and so on. So how do you manage it?
That's a very good question. And if you ask me some days, I'll tell you I'm not really managing it. But no, we have, because immigration and asylum, I suppose, is relatively new to the organisation, my colleague and I, Barbara Muldoon, who works with me in the immigration department, we tend to end up doing a lot of the policy work in that area.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge, but there's so much happening, and we feel that it's so important to voice the interests of children in all of these systems. And so we try and submit, responses to consultations wherever we can, and do as much as possible in our within capacity to advance those issues.
And it's so important to see that, the immigration, that is a separate section within the organisation, because thinking back, I remember in 2013 practicing in Belfast, there was literally a handful of solicitors doing immigration, and where some would dabble in it here and there, and it was very general. But now it seems to be, when I came back from Dublin and moved back home again, a massive growth in terms of practitioners, but everybody seems to be quite specialised as well, but so it's fantastic to see an organisation take on that role, and it's so important with I suppose numbers increasing as well, and very significant challenges facing immigrants here. We'll talk about that. And I think that's not going to end anytime soon. But just leading on from that, today, I suppose we've spoken about this we're obviously immigration practitioners here as well. We do have a group of colleagues, and I know one of them, Sinead Marmion, big shout out to Sinead, was on our podcast before, and there's a great group, and it's growing, isn't it, of people who are practicing in immigration barristers and solicitors in Northern Ireland. We all check in with each other now and again and give each other some support. But I remember recently speaking to somebody about working with vulnerable adults and vulnerable people in general, and how that really affects you as well. And I guess you're coming across probably among the most vulnerable in our society, unaccompanied and separated children. I mean, how difficult is it to, I suppose, do you get used to it? Do you get support? How do you find working with children in those positions?
So it's something that I have actually struggled with quite a bit recently, because of the nature of the cases. And I suppose the complexity, the trauma that you're seeing, the trauma that effectively you're putting the young people through again by making them repeat their story when they have repeated it time and time and time again. And, I have clients who can't, first of all, find it very difficult to understand the system, find it very difficult to understand why they're being asked certain questions, find it very, very difficult to understand why they're being asked the same questions over and over again. And I suppose that has become quite stark for me recently with a couple of cases in particular, where I've instructed, in a few cases, I've had to instruct consultant psychiatrists. I've also instructed trafficking experts and a torture expert as well. And hearing the stories, and I suppose what you do naturally when you hear anybody's story is that you create a picture in your mind, and that picture is just, it's the worst you could imagine. And I've had to sort of take a breath a few times, and I've had to ask for a bit of support with that. And I was very pleased that the Children's Law Centre actually recently organised a training event on vicarious trauma, because when you're hearing these stories, effectively you are experiencing secondary trauma, obviously nothing like what anybody who's experienced it firsthand has gone through, but it does take its toll. And I think probably when I started the work, and it was a new area of law for me, really. I had some experience of immigration and asylum before, but this was the first time where I was working entirely on asylum cases. And I'm keen to learn, I'm keen to get it right, I'm keen to I suppose do as much as I can, and then I've got to a point now where I've realised I have to protect myself so that I can do a good job for everybody that I'm working for. And so I've recently actually reached out and asked for a bit more support, and I'm very pleased that Children's Law Centre are in the process of arranging that for me. Yeah. So it is an important aspect, and I would have considered myself really resilient and very efficient, and I get lots of stuff done, and recently I thought, oh my goodness, I have to slow it down a bit, because I don't want to experience I don't want to experience burnout. I don't want to get to the point where I have to say I can't do this anymore, because I absolutely love working in this area. the reward in terms of when, you know, my clients are granted asylum is like nothing
It's
else
like nothing
I've
else.
ever experienced before. And, it, you know, in one sense it makes it all worthwhile, but in another sense there is a huge imbalance there because, you know, the vast majority of the time you're working on the cases, and then, you know, it's only a very small part of the time that you get to deliver that amazing news to someone.
Absolutely. And it's such rewarding work. But we have had people on, I think most of our guests who actually work in human rights. I mean, we've people working in criminal justice cases, legacy cases, immigration a couple of times. And everybody has the same challenge in terms of they bring it home. And it's not a job that you can just leave and go off. You could not possibly do that. And I guess it takes a certain person, but people get into this area because they're passionate. You know, they want to help people. You know, they're activist lawyers, I guess, as well. But really, you do have to think about that. And I remember years ago when I started out and I first worked with the Irish Refugee Council in Dublin, and, you know, you were kind of thrown in the deep end at that time. And, you know, I was just out of college and you're working with very, very vulnerable adults. And you took it home and you took it to heart, and it was very, very, you know, just difficult to hear people's stories and their journeys. And again, went through the same as you, started working on asylum cases. But you do have to, you know, take that into account, the toll it could have on mental health for all practitioners and solicitors in general anyway, in terms of taking on any, you know, can be very intense work. But it's good to see organisations like ILPA as well. I think now they've got, this is the Immigration Lawyers Practitioners Association, who have set up, I think, some mental health and well-being section to help support solicitors. So that's fantastic. But thanks for sharing that as well, Maria. And just again, I mean, we're not moving on to anything lighthearted here at all. We're going to touch on something that we've all spoken about recently, but maybe you'll give us an indication as to how it affects your work and your clients. Just for listeners, it's the Nationality and Borders Bill. Now, we've spoken about our very first podcast, Jack's here with me. Yeah. We spoke about the government's statement of changes, and at that time around immigration, which were again adding to the hostile environment, which is something we'll talk on again. But things just seem to be getting more stringent when it comes to, we'll say, Priti Patel's proposal for change. And no clients, none of our clients will escape, and especially people who are in more vulnerable positions like asylum seekers. So it's the Nationality and Borders Bill, and it was introduced by Priti Patel. And we were talking there a while ago. It's coming through quite quickly, but it's still at just about to come to committee stage.
That's right, yeah. So I think it's evidence stages at the moment, and then it goes to committee stage. I think it's the 19th of October.
Okay, so it's the 19th of October, so that's really soon.
It's really soon.
Yeah, so how, I mean, do you want to give us a little bit of insight into that, maybe for listeners, about how maybe it impacts your work?
Yeah, so when the immigration plan was published earlier this year, there was a 6-week window for consultation, which was a very, very narrow window, and I think it came at a time which was around the Easter holidays. A lot in it, in one sense, but lacking a lot of detail. Mm-hmm. And so working through the plan at that stage, obviously it was important for organisations like Children's Law Centre to look at it and put in a consultation response. And really, the Nationality and Borders Bill is effectively the worst piece of legislation in terms of the protection for refugees since the Refugee Convention. It seeks to distinguish and treat people differently depending on how they have arrived in the UK. And the UK continually talks about these so-called safe and legal routes, of which I'm not sure there are any. There are some resettlement programmes, but they're few and far between, and effectively the UK has not utilised that resettlement programme since March last year, at the start of the pandemic. And what it means is that probably about 95% of the clients that I've represented will feel the worst effects of this piece of legislation on the face of it as it is at the moment, because it seeks to treat people differently depending on how they have arrived. Yeah. And that different treatment will result in them not ever being eligible for refugee status, and this only being eligible for this new so-called temporary status, which will leave them with no recourse to public funds.
So how would they support? What does that mean exactly then? So they're just
Well,
had access?
it's not entirely clear at the moment what it means, but what they're proposing in this legislation is that there will be asylum accommodation for those who are in the system.
Okay.
They've talked as well about offshore processing.
That's right.
I remember that, yeah.
They have given no detail on what that means, but again, it's a lot of, I suppose, political posturing and effectively, in my view, trying to gain votes by sounding so-called strong on immigration.
Yeah.
But what they're doing is that they're stepping away from their obligations under international treaties, the Refugee Convention, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, everything. And ultimately, whilst this may be just another in a long list of actions taken by the current government for their own reasons, it's the people who are subject to this legislation that are going to suffer the most. Yeah. The inadmissibility rules that were introduced at the start of this year, which we presume are going to be reflected in the legislation, mean that the government are going to determine whether people have come through what they consider to be a safe country. And if on that basis they are either they have come through a country or there's evidence that they've been in a country that the UK considers safe, the UK is going to attempt to remove them to that country or to any other country, safe country in the world that will take the individual. At the minute, the UK hasn't secured any agreements with any third countries. And, I mean, actions that they're taking at the moment, particularly, for example, with regards to France, would suggest that they're never going to secure any such agreements. So in the meantime, they will not look at an asylum claim from an individual, and they will delay looking at the case for at least 6 months. And only then after, if they can't return them to any country, they will consider the application.
Wow.
And then the individual will only potentially be able to, or will only be granted this temporary status.
So it really seems just so punitive, and I don't know, I mean, it seems to be void of any understanding of the whole process involving a refugee applicant or applying for asylum. And you've heard so many commentators who actually work in the area speak about it, that it just makes no sense. This whole, you've touched on there about the safe routes. I mean, it seems to just ignore the reality as to how people arrive here and how people have been arriving in the UK. And obviously when I worked in Ireland, the same thing for years and years now.
And it seems that they're doing anything in their power to prevent someone from integrating into British society by not giving them any public funding, keeping them in certain
the hostile environment at its very finest,
and pushing everything
Absolutely.
down the road to make these people more vulnerable.
Yeah.
So they just have no chance.
It's startling that this affects so many of your clients who are already extremely vulnerable.
Extremely vulnerable.
How is that going to look?
I don't know that they care how it looks. I mean, in my mind, to my mind, they have created these so-called crises in the run-up to the introduction of this legislation. They have created a crisis, as they call it, in the English Channel. And I mean, the actions they're taking in that regard are absolutely deplorable. But they're also creating a crisis in relation to the intake units where they're saying we don't have accommodation. And recently we saw them being housed in detention centres, you know, newly arrived unaccompanied minors being housed, you know, in immigration centres, sleeping on seats, sleeping on the floor. And
these are children of all ages.
Yeah. And they call this a crisis when in fact, you know, there are accommodation sites available. You know, if they really wanted to, they could improve the system so that children are put into accommodation that's suitable to their needs when they arrive. And, you know, I just think that everything is a run-up to this, and so we have to become tough on immigration. And when you look at the number of people who have crossed the English Channel compared to the number of asylum applications, you know, it's probably, say last year, I think in 2020, there were somewhere in the region of 8,400 crossings in the English Channel, and then there were something like 29,000 or 29,500 asylum applications. So, there are people coming by other means, but when you look at this year, when airports have been closed, so more people are getting to the UK by whatever way they can,
means,
and they pay smugglers to get them to where they want to go. And the thing about it is I keep seeing it everywhere. I keep seeing it on social media. Why didn't they stay in France? Why didn't they stay in Greece? It was safe there. There's no obligation on anyone to claim asylum. There's no legal obligation to claim asylum in a first country. Those are rules that the UK have introduced.
And it's a myth that people kind of flout, especially through the media. I mean,
And the Refugee Convention states nothing of the sorts. And it also states that people should not be penalised for their mode of arrival. So, what the UK government are doing here is effectively, to my mind, in breach of the Refugee Convention. And it will be subject to challenge. And I think we will be wrapped up in legal challenges for years and years to come if the legislation is introduced.
It's inevitable. But as you said, this is a political war on, immigration, and it has been for the past 7-8 years as well, around the whole Brexit referendum. And this is just a spin-off from that we've spoken about here. But in reality, I know we've spoken about unaccompanied minors, and sometimes I take it for granted, obviously, because I've worked in immigration before. But can you explain just to listeners, how do you define somebody who arrives as an unaccompanied minor or a separated child in terms of applying for asylum?
Okay, so it is any young person under the age of 18 who arrives in the UK and who has no parent or guardian or anyone exercising parental rights in relation to that child. So that's broadly the definition.
Okay, gosh, yeah. So really a tough, I suppose, your policy section as well, like when you're working on that, you'll be really having that at the forefront of your mind.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
how the bill progresses. So we'll watch with bated breath.
I know. And the one thing I would say is that at the moment, the government has given assurances to different organisations that children will not be subject to this legislation, but there's absolutely nothing in the legislation at the moment that excludes them from the provisions of it. And so we have, that children will they be subject to these inadmissibility rules on the face of it, yes, which means the children that we would represent will not be entitled, if it goes forward, to refugee status, despite the fact that of those clients, the vast majority actually have been granted refugee status. So it shows that they are entitled to protection under the Refugee Convention, and under this new legislation, they won't get it.
And as I was saying, you can't rely on promises from the current government
don't know
for anything that they're going to do or not do.
It's quite startling, really. And it's, in reality, it's devastating for people who will be affected by it, but all we see is the bluster in the media around it. So we'll follow how that
and you
goes.
also see on the news and stuff that the increase in punishments is only going to affect traffickers. But when obviously doing a bit of research before you've come on and you look at the legislation proposed, the increase in punishment for illegal routes doesn't just affect traffickers, it affects anybody who comes in. So
absolutely.
I was reading there it's increased from like 6 months to 4 years.
Yes.
So they're presenting this thing that they're preventing human trafficking through the legal channels, but it affects those who are vulnerable.
Exactly. And when the immigration plan was published earlier this year, that the Home Secretary talked about wanting to make it a fairer system and wanting to protect refugees. And when you looked at the plan, we actually looked at it closely, and the words criminal and criminality appeared in the plan 45 times. Safeguarding appeared 4 times. And on 3 of those occasions, they were referring to the safeguarding of non-migrant children from adult asylum seekers.
Wow.
And that is just that just highlights their headspace when they're creating this. Like
no mention whatsoever of the Home Secretary's obligations under Section 55 of the Border Citizenship and Immigration Act 2009, which is telling in and of itself. They talk about children, but they have given absolutely, if they have given any thought, they've completely disregarded it.
Yeah.
Wow, and it's similar to the language we've seen as well with around the EU settlement scheme and even the withdrawal agreement, in that a real shift away from, you know, what they promised, which was to basically provide EU citizens with this easily facilitated access to residency here, whereas, you know, they really focus on the criminality element of it as well. So no change there, but we'll definitely get back in touch to see how matters evolve around that, and it's something that's very topical at the moment around our immigration group as well, I know. So just, Maria, as well, on top of your work, we spoke a little bit there about the fact that you are also the chair of the Law Society's Human Rights and Equality Working Group, a newly established group, a year into its existence. How is that going, first of all, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about your background as to how you got to where you are today.
Sure, no problem. So the Human Rights and Equality Working Group was established in September last year, 2020, and it followed the restructuring of the Law Society's Council. It has become a working group rather than a committee, because it was felt that being part of the committee system slightly hamstrung a committee of that nature in terms of reacting and, you know, doing some work on critical human rights issues, which are quite time sensitive. So it was to give it a wee bit more informality so that the group could react to events that were happening around the world, run events without it all having to go through the formal committee structure of the Law Society Council. So in terms of how it's been working, I mean, it's to my mind, although I am biased, I think the group has done amazing work in the very short time that it's been up and running.
A very difficult time.
Very difficult time, trying to sort of react or deal with a lot of issues coming up which impact human rights. And I mean, you could nearly have a full-time job doing it, but the members of the group, there are currently 10 members. If memory serves, I think 11. We've recently had a co-opted member. And, you know, they're so enthusiastic. Yeah. They're broad sort of range, level of experience of practitioners, and very, very committed to the work. So we met every month between September and December last year, and then I think bi-monthly thereafter. And we've done everything from giving evidence to the ad hoc committee on the Bill of Rights at Stormont, to informing the Law Society's response to the independent review of the Human Rights Act, attending a roadshow event, attending different events in relation to the independent review of the Human Rights Act. And I suppose our biggest piece of work this year has been focused on the legal profession, and we've been working very hard on that since about March this year, because members thought collectively, you know, there are so many things going on that we could be working on, but as a profession we need to look at ourselves first. How diverse and equal are we? Yeah. And you know, it's funny, I mentioned that to some people and they say, well, not at all.
Yeah, you've your work cut out for you, I think.
And I suppose there is that perception out there just based on experience, but we need to get the information first. So we're about to launch a survey among the profession. I'm not sure whether this podcast will go out before it launches because it's quite imminent, but I would be encouraging all members of the profession to respond to it, because we really need to gather the information. We're asking questions in there about social mobility, you know, about level of earnings, you know, as well as all the other sort of diversity and equality questions that you can imagine.
That's
you know,
fantastic.
And one thing also that I think will be quite telling potentially, you know, about whether you've had a member of the family who's been a solicitor or barrister. So just interesting in terms of getting into the profession and then progression within the
some
profession.
Insight. I would say you'll get quite good feedback.
I think so.
In
I
relation
hope
to
so.
that, I think the profession will be, you know, happy to contribute to something because it's needed to have that piece of research,
exactly.
you know, and people will be interested in it. I know I will.
Yeah, so we have engaged Cognizance, independent researchers. And when we brought this proposal to the Law Society Council, I mean, the support was overwhelming, because I think, you know, in light of events that happened around the world last year and work carried out by other organisations, they realised the real need for the Law Society of Northern Ireland to carry out this survey, and then to set in place a programme of events to, I suppose, deal with any of the issues it brings up in terms of the results.
So when does the survey?
We don't have a date, because it's all, you know, it's amazing whenever you go through a survey and you don't realise we have poured over every word, you know, and we've carried out test runs, and we're looking at the word and we're saying, should that word go before that word, you know? So I would expect that it will launch before the end of September, and it will be open for 2 weeks. Wow. So I don't have an exact date.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for that one.
Great.
And so just, Maria, you said, I know you're very specialised now in terms of your practice area, and I think it's getting more like that, isn't it, in terms of solicitors in general seem to be really honing in on their own niche area of expertise. But you'd mentioned that previously you'd done some asylum, but what was the other, your background in terms of, had you experience in any other areas of law, and how did you get to where you are? Is this something that you naturally fell into, or, you know, I think listeners like to hear how people working in human rights or public interest litigation, etc., got into it. So,
do you want the long story?
give us whatever. Give us the story. We're here. It's a rainy Friday in Uri.
Exactly.
Okay, so I studied law and politics at Queen's. Started in 2000. Coming up to my final year, I thought, I'm not going to do law. There's too much reading.
Do we all do that? Yeah.
We probably all go through that. And so I thought, a career in journalism, that's for me. So I started writing some articles and went to the Students' Union to get them published in the Students' Union newspaper. And then somebody encouraged me into Student Union politics, which I then did for 2 years. And then
that gives you some grounding, I would say.
I'm telling you, that second year was probably, I mean, it filled my CV for for years ahead. So then Institute of Professional Legal Studies, and I got a training contract at what was then Napier and Sons, and it's now Napier Solicitors in Belfast, insolvency and bankruptcy specialists, and also employment, conveyancing and litigation. So I went into the litigation department. I did that for many years and I really enjoyed it, cut my teeth on that, and then just, I suppose, I had been doing it effectively for 14 years before I moved on. But in the middle of all that, I decided, first of all, that I wanted to do advanced advocacy, because I always had a bit of a hankering to the barrister route, although I was happy then, you know, that with the solicitor route and being employed and not having all that responsibility. So I did the advanced advocacy course, and then I did a volunteering project, actually. This is what it really all came out of. And I went to Brazil for 3 months, and I worked with an organisation called SERVE and Young Africa over there in Mozambique. And I kind of came back with more questions than answers, just about global inequality and those sorts of issues. And so I decided to do a Master's in Human Rights Law at Queen's on a part-time basis, which I started in 2015. And at very early on, that was around the time of the Mediterranean crisis, and I decided I was going to focus on immigration and asylum. And then I thought, well, what particular area? And I just thought there really was little to no defence of the UK's position in relation to unaccompanied minors. So that was my subject for my dissertation. And coming towards the end of it, I was approached by NICRAS, Northern Ireland Community of Refugees and Asylum Seekers, and they had a lot of clients who were saying, you know, I suppose the services they were getting from solicitors maybe wasn't as satisfactory as what they would have wanted. And they asked me to produce a policy document on best practice for the provision of immigration legal advice services. It was a very long title, which I then produced over the following 8 months. Again, I was on a 1 day a week basis, and still working in Napier's 4 days a week. And every time I kept coming to the mass, can I do this thing now? They were very, very accommodating and very good to me. I'm very supportive. And so at the launch of that document, I was approached by Bernardo's, who had just won the contract to provide the independent guardian service for unaccompanied minors. And they asked me to come on board on a consultancy basis to provide advice to the guardians and to the service about, you know, matters which intersect with, you know, legal aspects. And then it was really then that I decided I want to do this properly, and I want to invest my time and my energy into it, because as much as I started an interest when I was studying and I took a few cases at Napier's, it was very, very difficult to really know the subject when I wasn't doing it all the time. And also, I suppose, wanting to do good. And that's why I decided then when the job came up, and actually I had decided that I didn't want to go and practice immigration law in a private solicitor's firm, just because I wasn't as au fait with legal aid, and all I heard was horror stories.
That's interesting you say that, and that's what we were chatting about. Our last recording was with pills and about different kind of routes into law and whether people practice or not. But that's interesting that you've qualified, you're a practicing solicitor and an immigration solicitor. But that was your choice then, to go an alternative route to the norm, which would have been to go into a firm.
Yeah, I think just the pressures of, billing and all that come no matter what area of law you're practicing.
You're right. No matter what area, that pressure's still there. And as you said, getting to grips with the legal aid system. I worked in Dublin for years and then went to Belfast, where they didn't have legal aid for asylum, or there was a completely different system in the Republic of Ireland. And to get to grips with the green form and everything here, it was like a job in itself for me. It was so
oh my goodness,
so difficult. And you do hear, we ourselves, Maria, we're in touch with a lot of immigration solicitors at the moment who are absolutely flooded. But the admin side that goes into managing, those to being compliant with legal aid, etc., is just
I have to do it now as part of my work a bit, but it's excruciating at times.
It is. And it's unnecessary to have. It really needs reform. I think
it does.
And we have spoken a little bit about that in this, so it's probably something we'll cover again. So that's interesting. Then.
So then. As I say, it was only a specific job that I would have went for, and this one came out, fit the bill. And in fact, it is funny that when it first came out, I didn't get it first time round. And when I heard who I sort of, in inverted commas, had lost it to, or who had got it, I'd only heard of Barbara Muldoon by reputation.
Yes.
And when I got a phone call a few months later to say, we have a new solicitor, Barbara Muldoon, and there's actually more work than she can handle. Will you join us? And I said, well, this is actually the perfect outcome, because now I'm working with someone who has so much experience and a wealth of knowledge in the area, and really,
she's fantastic.
She is absolutely brilliant. So to go in and also have the support of someone like her was amazing in terms of my, introduction to it on a sort of full-time basis. I really was so grateful for that, because it has been the steepest learning curve of my life.
Absolutely, I'm sure. That's excellent. It's great to have the support, to have two of you there. And as you said, Barbara's so experienced, within immigration in general, so it's lovely. So that's great. Such a great journey. And our listeners as well, it's something we speak about with all of our guests. Obviously, the name of the podcast is Activist Lawyer. And it's so interesting. Everybody has their own kind of unique take on what that means, either to them or what, how they would encourage people, I suppose, to get into. So what are your thoughts, Maria, in terms of, our industry, law in general, and activism, and,
Yeah, I think that you can become a bit disillusioned depending on, what area of law you're in, and you might feel that you're sort of in that particular field and you don't have expertise elsewhere. But I actually made the conscious decision that despite having had nearly 15 years experience in a particular area, that there was another area that I wanted to work in, and it was a matter of starting at the beginning, learning as much as I could, going on as many courses. And in fact, I did the OISC exams, because I thought, well, if I'm ever going to know it, this is the way to know it. And so for me, it was a big decision in one sense, but it was also the most natural decision, because as much as I loved Napier's and the people in it, the work didn't really inspire me the way that when I was studying the Masters, I really was energized. I wanted to do something about it. And I thought, well, I've got the perfect career. I didn't want to, step out of the career because I worked so hard to get the qualification. And I wanted then to use that. And now effectively I'm doing that. And I think, you know, when you surround people, as you say, the group that we're in at the moment, and I met Sinead Marmion when I was studying, we both studied the masters together. That's when we met for the first time. And it was great to go on your lunch breaks and just talk about all the stuff and get so passionate about it.
Sinead's a great one. And,
Yeah.
you know, we both had a word about this, the ranting that goes on among immigration practitioners, or I'd say human rights and practitioners in general is
Yeah, I know. And I
part
think
of us.
it definitely is part of us, but also you know what the other person is going through whenever they're, you know, just
Yeah.
having one of those
You
days
do.
where like,
You're
and
all in it together.
yeah, we're all in together,
It's
and
great
some days you
support.
go, I don't think I can do this, and then somebody says, yeah, you have to.
Yeah.
We can all do it, and we have to keep going. So it is a great group. I just hope that more people decide to specialise in this area, because I do think in this jurisdiction we are potentially lacking in immigration and asylum legal expertise,
Yeah,
particularly given what, you know, what lies ahead of us.
exactly.
And the need for it going forward. And I hope also that any private firms out there will invest in this area, because I know the legal aid fees are atrocious. But it's a matter of, you know, battling the Legal Services Agency on that, and also maybe not putting pressure on the practitioners in those departments, because it's so important. If we effectively, I know this sounds really grandiose, but if we want to live in the society that we, you know, hold as acceptable for ourselves, you know, we have to ensure that for others as well. And as you say, law is a route that we can use to affect those changes.
That's so interesting, and that investment is keen, because without being able to provide the service, which we aren't, everyone's stretched at the moment, and I don't think people realise the pressure on practitioners. It's extraordinary, and as you said, it could get worse, given what lies ahead. So, I mean, anyone listening, I hope that rings a bell with some people as well, and that's a really, really great suggestion. So, I mean, thank you so much, Maria.
You're very welcome.
Joining us
Great,
today.
yeah. Thank you very much.
And we really look forward to following the work of the Children's Law Centre and all that you do. It's fantastic, and thank you for sharing your journey with us.
You're very welcome, and it was lovely to be here and lovely to be invited, so thank you.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.